Welcome, everyone. Good morning again for those of us who are just waking up. My name is Zinat Ladak. I am a volunteer with the CSPC program committee this year. I'd like to remind everyone to tweet with the hashtag CSPC 2022 and at Science Policy. Yes, there's many seats around. Please come and sit. So this panel that we have for you today is titled Weaving Indigenous Science and Federal Research, Barriers and Bright Spots. This panel is hosted by Health Canada in collaboration with the Indigenous Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics Cluster, or ISTEM. And I just want to announce, this may have come up in your apps as well. After today's panel, there's also an informal meet and greet with Dr. Kara Tannenbaum, the moderator from today's session, who's also the Chief Science Advisor of Health Canada, and Dr. Sarah Vibak, who's the Chief Science Officer with Public Health Agency of Canada. So it's an informal meet and greet with the two of them in the Governor General 1 room. So 2 rooms over that way. Feel free to go and grab your lunch and then walk over to that room to have that conversation with them. It's going on from 12 to 12:30-ish today.
You're just asking if we can move the screen to the middle for the PowerPoint.
Oh.
It's not possible.
I don't
So
think
you should
so.
tell people that many of our speakers
Oh,
will be
yes.
there.
So for this panel, we have 2 moderators and 4 speakers. 3 of the speakers or 3 of the panelists are virtual. So they will be on the screen over here as well as the PowerPoints. Yeah.
So anyone who wants to migrate over
Yeah.
to that side, we do have some seats left.
And I think we'll get started now. So I will hand it over to Dr. Kara Tannenbaum.
Emily, can I let you start?
Absolutely. I hope there we go. Thanks very much. So thanks to everyone for attending today. Really great to see so many people in the room. Our apologies that at the last minute, a couple of our presenters are virtual, but I think we have a really, really excellent session for you today. But before we begin, I just wanted to introduce myself. Ani Buju, Emily Missy Abbott Macaulay, Indigenous ni mama o shasku banishi ni baba ni owada Mijnikazoak, Odawan Indigiba, Animo Zibi Indujiba. My name is Emily Missy Abbott Macaulay. I am a daughter of a 60s scoop survivor. So my mom and I are members of Lake Manitoba First Nation, but I was born and raised here in Algonquin Territory in Ottawa. I just wanted to acknowledge that these lands are the ancestral, unceded, unsurrendered lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg Nation. And as an Anishinaabe woman living out of my home territory, I will be forever grateful for being hosted upon these lands and for being able to receive the teachings that are held in these lands that the Algonquin peoples have been stewards of since time immemorial. I guess I'll continue by introducing myself. So I am a biologist by training. I did complete my PhD at Simon Fraser University a few years ago, where I was lucky enough to meet one of the panelists that we'll be speaking with today. I have been with Agriculture Agri-Food Canada for about 7 years now. I'm now director of our Indigenous Science Liaison Office, as well as director of our interdepartmental Indigenous STEM cluster. Very happy to see a lot of iSTEM cluster members in the room and audience today. So I think I'll leave it there for now, and I will turn it over to Dr. Tannenbaum to introduce herself. Miigwech.
Thank you. What I've learned from my Indigenous colleagues is that if possible, we would all be sitting in a circle, which means that we're all equal, which means that I'm going to have you just call me Kara. I recently hosted an event with where I co-moderated with Elder Valerie Nicholson, and she said that no one should even use titles because we all bring to the discussion equal knowledge, equal perspectives, and so I'd like to set the stage today with some principles that we're all equal, we're all here with humility. If you're in the room, then you are committed to reconciliation. Yes, my name is Kara Tannenbaum. I'm the Departmental Science Advisor for Health Canada and also Scientific Director for the Institute of Gender and Health for the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And I too am grateful to be hosted today on the one end of the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe. I come from the Kanien'kehá:ka territory. And I think we want it to be an informal session as much as possible. When Hashu, where are you, Hashu, who organized this amazing event? invited me to co-moderate, I said, well, no, Emily is going to be here and you know so much more about reconciliation. Why do you need a co-moderator? And Emily, I hope you don't mind me saying what you said, but you said, no, Kara, like reconciliation means two-eyed seeing. It means that you, as someone non-Indigenous who's experiencing reconciliation from your perspective, needs to be here so that we're in this together. And I thought that that was wonderful. So I don't really have much to add except that, pass on other lessons. I told Elder Valerie recently that I have made so many mistakes. So if you want to know what not to do, just speak to me. I could tell lots of stories about trying to be in good relation with good intention. And sometimes it really backfired badly. But Elder Valerie told me there's no such thing as a mistake. There's just opportunities for learning and growth. And if you're not sitting in a zone of discomfort, then you're probably not learning and growing. So I'm excited about our panel. The goal today is really to share stories and experiences, as well as lessons learned from 4 amazing panelists. We're going to hear what they have to share. For those of you coming in, please come. There's a few extra seats up here. Just don't want you to stand for 90 minutes. There's a lot of seats up here. Please come. And then really it's up to you. And I would invite you to be as forthcoming as possible. There's no such thing as a bad question. Anything that you've ever wondered about or curious about, experiences, successes, and failures that you want to share, that's really the goal of the meeting today, so that when you leave, you feel a little bit more empowered to take the next step on your journey towards reconciliation in research. Now, who's in the room? Raise your hand if you're from academia, maybe? Okay, raise your hand if you're from the federal system. Okay, raise your hand if you're from somewhere else and you want to share that with us. Thank you. And I think that's a good point. I was in a session yesterday where we were talking about federal versus academia, and somebody said provincial, and maybe this is more of a national I think, journey. So thank you for saying that. Anyone else? Yeah. Provincial funding agency. Thank you. Okay, so we've got some government at arm's reach agencies. So all of us in this together. Yeah. A science writer. Excellent. Communication is so important, right? Yeah. Not-for-profit tech sector. Oh, I kind of wish that we could go around and everyone could be a panelist and we could hear like, what brought you here? I think there was somebody else. Yeah. Sustainability consulting. And gosh, the good thing about being online is that everyone could write in the chat, and we can't do that here, but are you kind of curious what people are hoping to get out of the session today?
Absolutely.
What are folks hoping to get out of the session today? Yeah. Okay, so talking points, how to be compelling. What words should we actually use? Emily, have you had experience with that?
I thought we would get into the Q's and A's a little bit later, but no, but I think that's great. So
okay.
Absolutely, we do have, I think you will get a lot of good advice on that today. And yeah, just keep your ears open for our 4 presenters, because I think they're going to have some pretty good, I think they have some well-polished speaking points in there. Yeah.
All right. Anything else people want to put out there before we start? Sometimes it's good for the presenters to know kind of what you're hoping for. Yeah.
Voice that doesn't project very well.
Can we hear her now? Is the mic on the floor on? Helpful tech person who's.
Thank you.
Okay.
No, I think it's in the title of the session, but I'm really interested in hearing about the tensions, the discomfort of weaving Indigenous knowledges with European and Western knowledge systems, and when it doesn't work, when it's not possible to do it, and what forms of violence happen in those moments of discomfort and tension. So I'm hoping this is a good space for truth telling, where we can achieve that. And I think it's something that a lot of Indigenous folks I've had the privilege of speaking with lately have encouraged. And so I'm also trying to encourage other people to come with that attitude of truth telling.
Great.
Well, I think that's excellent. Like one thing that we always say, we talk about reconciliation all the time. And I think people forget sometimes that it's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that brought us here. And we really do need to learn about that truth and acknowledge it and hold it as Canadians before we can get onto this exciting reconciliation path. I think people really it's that discomfort. We all feel, I think, a lot of guilt. But UBC put out a statement quite a few years ago that said, if we can feel national pride, we can also feel national shame. And I think that's kind of the point that we're at right now. So absolutely, truth telling is part of today for sure.
Thank you. It's also important, I've learned, to create culturally safe, trauma-informed spaces. And what that means actually is that if anyone feels activated, if anything that's said here today elicits emotions, we invite you at any time. If you need to step out, we'll stay after, although I think I'm staying after for another session. But if you want to debrief afterwards, I could certainly volunteer myself after the next session if people want to talk about it. I think it's important to know that whatever it is that you're feeling or thinking is normal, common, part of the journey. And I'm not going to say what's said in the room stays in the room, because hopefully you'll take some lessons out with you. But obviously, if there's any confidential stories or you feel that people are really being vulnerable or speaking with humility, we ask you to respect that and honor that. So I think that's the best we could do before jumping into the panel. What do you think?
I think that was excellent.
Let's hit it.
Yep. And I see Steve on the screen. So I'd be very happy to introduce him next. So Steve, I don't know if you heard, but we're doing away with titles today. So, and I hope that's okay because we work together quite often. So to introduce Steve, he is a science advisor with Ecosystems and Ocean Sciences at Fisheries and Oceans Canada. He provides support and guidance to the science sector with regards to reconciliation, which we just spoke about, including shifting towards models of knowledge co-production, which is what Isha was just touching on as well. So he was a postdoctoral research fellow duly affiliated with the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center at the University of Maryland and the Stockholm Resilience Center at Stockholm University. As an environmental social scientist, his research focuses on community-based conservation and natural resource management, environmental governance, and the human dimensions of environmental change, which I think a lot of natural scientists were trained to kind of ignore or control for human impacts, but not really recognize our relationship within our ecosystems. As an interdisciplinary educator, Steve spent a decade working with NGOs and universities across North America, teaching and developing both curricula and programs. I will now turn it over to Steve to present on towards an ethical space of engagement for bridging multiple ways of knowing in aquatic research and monitoring. Over to you, Steve.
Good morning, and thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Always makes me a little, squirmy hearing about all of that. But also, I want to thank our panelists, fellow panelists, for contributing to this amazing session. Really extend gratitude to Emily and Kara for moderators and the invitation to contribute to such an important discussion, and hopes that I'm able to share a bit about some of the work that I've been so fortunate to be engaged in. And I join you today from the traditional unceded territories of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin peoples here in the Ottawa region, where I live, work, play, and raise my family. But I was originally born and raised by my parents in the traditional lands of the Mohawk and Mohegan people in the Mohawk River Valley in northern New York. So today, I've been invited to share some of the work that I've been doing in close collaboration with Danica Littlechild, Nicole Clank, and Christine Song. And I'm honored and privileged and carry the weight of the opportunity to share this work which we've been collaborating on, focused on an ethical space of engagement for bridging multiple ways of knowing. Now, ethical space was first put forward as a concept by Elder Willie Ermine during his master's thesis in 2000, focused on research ethics with Indigenous peoples. And then more recently, and those of you who may have come across the term and phrase and concept, it's been put into practice over the last decade plus by Elder Dr. Reg Croshu, who Danica worked closely with, facilitating and putting into practice ethical space in the context of climate change, energy regulation, and the conservation, Indigenous conserved and protected areas. And perhaps most significantly and most recently, it was a guiding principle and concept for the Indigenous Circle of Experts. So this work kind of builds on all of this work that Danica has been involved with as a practitioner, and this desire to help to try to operationalize and articulate what ethical space means and looks like in practice, and specifically in the context of collaborative research and monitoring. And it was that shared commitment and motivation and interest that spurred this partnership and collaboration and journey which we've been on. And what I'm sharing with you is ongoing. It's still in development, and we're still kind of working through how we share it. And so it's really a privilege to be able to share some of this work with all of you. Now, we define ethical space as an emerging practice that enables respectful engagement between and amongst Indigenous peoples, non-Indigenous peoples, and the natural world, and is a potentially transformative approach to working across multiple ways of knowing. Specifically, ethical space is something that is co-created by Indigenous and non-Indigenous actors in an effort to engage within a redefined framework of relations, conduct, obligations, and rights. Very important to recognize all of those aspects in this redefining framework. Now, what we wanted to do is to take a strength-based approach and to look what can we learn and how can we better articulate ethical space by identifying a set of exemplar cases. And so we wanted to kind of, the metaphor we were using was this idea of bubbling up to the surface, these exemplar cases. And I think it speaks to this panel when we talk about bright spots of weaving ways of knowing. And so for our case, we turned to a large set of case studies that have been identified, and all of those, what they shared in common was they were collaborative studies that aim to bridge Indigenous science and Western science in aquatic research and monitoring in Canada. So specifically, those stemmed from 2 systematic maps that have been conducted over the last 4 years. Both of those have been published, resulting in a collection of 140 case studies. We want specifically those related to research and monitoring, and so we identified 62 that we included in the end. Then we turned to some incredible work by Indigenous scholar Dominique David Chavez, who developed an evaluative framework to look at community-based research and Indigenous-led research related to climate change, and evaluated those with regards to levels of participation and the quality of participation in terms of community engagement and community contributions from Indigenous communities globally. And so we built on that framework as a way to kind of evaluate these previously published studies to get a better sense, to think about how we can kind of bubble up to the surface those exemplar cases. So you can imagine by doing this very simple scatter plot as we move from left to right, we increase in the level of Indigenous participation, which we scored across 5 different stages of the research. And then as we move from the bottom to the top, we increase in the presence of the number of quality indicators, because as David Chavez and colleagues note, along with many other Indigenous scholars and practitioners, it's not just about the level of participation, it's about the quality of that participation. It's about authority, decision-making authority. It's about things like accessibility of findings and credit and acknowledgement and data sovereignty. And so we were looking for all those cues and clues within these published studies. We wanted to narrow in a bit more though, so we added some additional characteristics that we were looking at around those, whether there was former relationships, whether it was initiated by the community. And as a result of all of this, we were able to bubble up to the surface and identify 12 exemplar cases. So this was really just an exercise right now, this first step, about how do we identify those exemplar cases of doing research in a good way that are illustrative of ethical space. Now, from that, then our next objective was to engage these exemplars as a way to kind of invoke and uncover and articulate what ethical space looks like in practice. So we draw upon these studies to further develop and better understand ethical space. And we see these 12 cases scattered across what is present day Canada. Now, this involved the deliberative and interpretive analysis to identify a set of salient elements. And through Danica's close partnership and collaboration, this involved, as she would often say, the systematic engagement with Indigenous knowledge systems through her interpretation of these cases, through the dialogue, and through the analysis. Now, this was all complemented by the perspectives, lived experiences, expertise, and knowledge contributed by Nicole, Christine, and myself. And it was the intermingling of insights that emerged from the collective dialogical engagement with these 12 exemplars over a 2-year period that resulted in our deeper understanding collectively of ethical space and our articulation of it. Now, where did that journey bring us to? And how are we starting to understand and articulate what ethical space as a practice looks like? It's outlined here in this figure, which we worked on. And there's a lot to take in. And what I'm going to do over the next 5 slides is unpack 5 salient elements to help illustrate the nuances and the aspects that are visualized in many different layers here and through lots of different meaning and metaphor. Now, at the core of ethical space is dialogue and conflict. It is a dialogical process, which is central to how it is enacted and the practice. It's about people coming together, individuals, communities, and working across cross-cultural systems. Now, second, and this is something that Danica often highlighted, drawing on her own experience from working in many different contexts and also drawing out of these cases, that it's not conflict free. There will be conflict. There will be discomfort. This is something we heard earlier when the moderators were opening the panel. There is no doubt going to be discomfort, but it's important to work through that, to face it, take it head on, and be able to embrace the uncomfortableness. And 2 of the things that help us do that, and these are things that we saw come through in those different exemplar cases, was the importance of reflexivity and positionality. And those help us to engage in those humble and honest dialogues where we come with an open heart and an open mind, and to work through that conflict and that discomfort. Now, the second salient element that we identified focuses on the research process and the practices around research. And by doing that, it draws out 3 important insights. The first is around participation and power, and specifically the importance of the continuity and shared decision-making authority across every stage of the research process. It's not just about deep engagement and partnership to identify the questions and perhaps design the research, but it's about that decision-making authority that's given to communities throughout every stage of the process to ensure it's reflecting their values and their priorities, and it's elevating Indigenous ways of knowing. Now, the second element, the second aspect of this was that by focusing on the research process, it brings forward and draws our attention to the specific practices and approaches. And when we looked across those 12 exemplars, we could look at the variety of the methodological approaches and the prevalence of community-based participatory research, which in and of itself seeks to empower communities and seeks to shift where decision-making authority is and about shared decision-making authority. It also, by looking at this particular element, it draws our attention to the diverse methods, the diverse approaches to data collection, analysis, and interpretation, those that are more participatory, those that are more dialogical, bringing people together in discussion as they work through shared understanding and experiences. It's created in these moments that we come together. And for many of you who participate in research collaborations or support these collaborations, they take place over very long time frames. And we come together and then we go back to our daily lives. We're back in our offices, our desks, our universities, our departments. And then that research project is one of many other things we do. And similarly to the communities that we work with and partner with, that this is one of many of the things that we do. And so we move into and out of this ethical space. And that's so important to recognize because it helps to shift how we approach and re-engage and always reset our intention when we come back together. Now, element number 3 highlights the centrality of Indigenous research principles of respect, relevance, reciprocity, relationships, and responsibility. And I can't go into all of these and what emerged and how these were manifested across those 12 exemplar cases. But just as one example, when we talk about respect, Indigenous Anishinaabe scholar Deb McGregor speaks about how every culture has a manifestation of respect, and respect is often core to every culture, but how it manifests looks different. In the context of these exemplars, we saw this manifest with regards to epistemic difference and respecting those differences. We also saw it when it came to acknowledgement and credit for the contributions of elders, of knowledge keepers, of youth, of community members, of technicians, and highlighting those, whether it was through authorship or through the acknowledgement section, or making space and place and elevating their role. Now, the 4th salient element is around emerging ethics and standards. And this is something that Danica speaks regularly about in terms of the importance of these ethics and standards which guide the interaction, the rules of engagement. And collectively, it's these standards which are identified and agreed upon. They establish the rules of engagement and govern the interactions in ethical space. These can be formalized or codified. Those can be international, like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They could be national standards, like the Tri-Council Policy Statement regarding the ethical conduct of research involving humans, or they can be local standards. So they can come from many places. And in some regards, this is one of the most important aspects to how we establish and create an ethical space of engagement is by collectively identifying the ones that are being used collectively to guide these rules of engagement. But this can be one of the most challenging ones too, because it can be overwhelming as we think about all of the different possible standards and ethics that might be drawn upon. And that's why it's always a collective effort to work through and identify those which are going to guide the particular interaction. And they'll be different with each partnership, with each research project. But they can also be less formalized or codified. Now, salient element number 5 is around the context. And when we look at the context around the knowledge, legal, and cultural systems that are coming together in this cross-cultural space, it's about elevating Indigenous systems. It draws attention to recognizing the diverse histories, trajectories, and futures that individuals bring when they come into these spaces. And it's important that we hold those, elevate those, acknowledge them. And finally, when we look at salient element number 5 in the context, it draws attention to the braiding process that can take place, and to those braids, but also to the knots. And something Danica often would joke about, we all want to talk about pretty braids. Nobody wants to talk about an ugly braid. Nobody wants to talk about a knot in their braid, but those are going to happen. And this brings us back to the dialogue and to the conflict and the discomfort. And it's okay. And you'll see in our articulation here, there are no doubt going to be knots. There are going to be bumps along the road, but it's about working through those and coming through the other side. Now, with that, I'd like to close with just a few final remarks from my colleagues. Now, as a relational framework, ethical space is not meant to be a static protocol requiring only compliance with specified principles and guidelines. Such an interpretation would render ethical space yet another checkbox exercise, robbing it of its performative power. Instead, it is more accurate to understand and implement ethical space as a framework for skilled practice. So just like learning to recognize and follow animal tracks or learning to navigate a boat in difficult waters, guidance, principles, maps, values, and ideas can only go so far in helping us improve our skills. It is continued practice by being attuned to context and by refining our abilities of observation and response that we improve any skill. So engaging in ethical space requires openness and dedication to the process and to the practice wherever it takes us within the bounds of the research. Therefore, what it means to achieve an ethical space depends on the relationships that compose that particular partnership and how they evolve. Accordingly, there is no certainty in achieving goals, no preconceived ideal state. Rather, ethical space in and of itself is a dynamic normative target. Thank you, merci beaucoup, and miigwech.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for, reinforcing that conflict and discomfort is part of the process. Our next speaker is Gary Malik. Gary is an air health effects scientist with Health Canada's Water and Air Quality Bureau. He leads research that measures the impact of air pollution exposures in vehicles, homes, First Nation communities, hospitals, and he evaluates actions to reduce these exposures. So, Gary, you've had some on-the-ground experience implementing a lot of the, well, I'd say almost theoretical concepts, and you've turned them into practice and action. So please go ahead and tell us about your study, Sioux Lookout Zone First Nations Indoor Air Study. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Kara. I'm just waiting for my slides to pop up, but there's very little air quality data from First Nations communities in Canada. There was one study about a decade back in the Assembly of First Nations. Then a few years went by, and an air scientist showed up in a remote northern First Nations community. He negotiated with a local First Nations man to host his air quality monitoring equipment on his land and paid the man about $20 a month. And he would return every couple of weeks to calibrate his monitors, switch out filters. And over a period of about 16 months, he forged a relationship with this man, and he was able to purchase about $90 worth of fish from this First Nations man. At that point, he identified himself as a conservation officer, and the man was charged with selling fish from his First Nation. He was basically impersonating us. And it's this type of context that we're arriving with into First Nations communities when we're doing our research. And we have to ask ourselves what we're doing within our programs and organizations to build trust, and more importantly, not destroy the trust in the relationships. Because, I mean, for air pollution studies, it was like N equals 3, and one of them was a government sting operation. So how can we arrive? How can I go knock on people's doors, First Nations homes, and be invited in to do the work that I do? Knock on the door from the federal government is usually not a good sign, no matter where you are. I mean, the obvious answer is that we need to be invited, and we have to be invited back, not least of which because I probably left really expensive monitoring equipment inside the homes. We spend about 90% of our time indoors, like we are right now. The role of the government, we provide guidance, we provide regulations in terms of indoor air quality, and all of these things rely on data. And we want First Nations exposures to be represented in these activities and these programs. So when I'm writing a research proposal, feeding into these programs looks great on a proposal for funding. When I'm in community, the reason has to be that there's going to be some kind of benefit to the First Nations communities themselves, direct benefits to the communities, because otherwise you probably don't have business being there. This is the Sioux Lookout Zone, an area of about 33 communities in Northwest Ontario. Most of them are fly-in only, except for a few weeks in the winter when there's winter roads in place. Each community has a nursing station, and as health concerns become more serious, people are airlifted into hospitals in Sioux Lookout or onwards to Winnipeg or Thunder Bay. There were ongoing community concerns for a long time about the air quality in the homes, concerns about mold, and also, of course, concerns about the high rates of respiratory tract infections and airlifts happening with the children living in these homes. So these discussions were ongoing for years, and the questions emerged about what is the air quality like in these homes, and is there some connection between the IAQ, indoor air quality, and the children's health. So together, we came up with a research project. The objective was to measure indoor air quality and examine relationships with lower respiratory tract infections in the people living in the homes. My role is really on the measurement side, and I should say, in terms of the measurements that we conduct in these types of studies, we used mature measurement technologies. We were collecting data that we knew how to interpret it. We knew how to make it relevant, and that it would be health relevant to the people in the communities. It's not really an area to be using newfangled technologies where you're stuck with the data, not sure how to interpret it afterwards. So we went into 4 communities, looked at about 100 First Nations homes. In terms of engagement, we presented to the Chiefs Council on Health, which had representatives from all of the communities in the area. We discussed the project and got a resolution of support. The communities that were interested in participating approached us and showed their interest. We then conducted community visits. We met with the chief and council. We met with elders. We jumped on the radio to answer community questions. We met with the health center, housing staff to make sure that it would be feasible to do the work. We'd be able to find a truck, workspace, staff. We had to find staff from the communities to collect the data. Generally, we used community health representatives. These were people that worked in the nursing stations. They were known and trusted by the community from a health context already. They were responsible, and they collected almost all the data. They recruited participants. They set up our air quality monitors. They administered the surveys. And in terms of the quality of the data, I mean, it shouldn't need to be said, but you know, I would say that these people have been just as good as any of the masters or engineering students that we've used in other studies across Canada. The work and the research that we've done based on the data collected on the ground in these communities has been published and in well-cited journals. Even a lot of the guidance about portable air cleaners that we've been hearing is based on work that was conducted with the Assembly of First Nations. That was pretty much the first study to show the effectiveness of those units in improving air quality, improving the health of the people in houses using those units. The findings, well, indeed, the community concerns were valid. There were housing issues, and those housing issues were related to the children's health in the communities. Most of the homes exceeded the Health Canada guidelines for CO2. CO2 is an indication of ventilation. It's like how much of the air in the room has already been exhaled by somebody else. Most of the homes, almost all of them, were built with mechanical ventilation, but only 10% of the homes had those units running and in good condition. So the work we did was, on the ground, it was good at characterizing some of these inequities. And there's a lot of work that's done to characterize inequities and exposures, but I think we're trying to move past that and trying to reduce these inequities. So while we were still in the community, we made sure, first of all, that if there were safety concerns, those were communicated to the banned housing, and made sure that we followed up to make sure those were remedied. The banned housing staff received training from First Nations consultants on remedying some of these things that we identified as being problems in the homes, related to mold, related to wood stoves, related to the forced air ventilation in the communities. And also, the study team worked with First Nations youth and artists to co-develop educational knowledge translation materials that were not just evidence-based, but packaged in a way that would be culturally relevant and appropriate for the people in the communities. And those materials are still being handed out in the nursing stations. They're being handed out right now at the NAN Housing Summit, alongside Health Canada guidance and alongside copies of our CMAJ manuscript. So they're armed with a lot of materials, and all of these materials are fitting seamlessly into ongoing efforts that are being led by the communities. We can't divorce ourselves from the political and cultural context in which our work is conducted, especially because I and a lot of you work for the Crown. We represent another nation. We're a symbol of a nation that's had unfair dealings with in the past and in the present with their nation. So how do we move forward? We need to build relationships, expand our networks, and make ourselves relevant, attractive organizations for them to work with. Many of the collaborators on the project have now gone on to be collaborators on other research projects like the Fancy study with the Assembly of First Nations, amongst others. Personally, I found this work to be extremely rewarding, professionally rewarding, and I urge anybody to take on these projects, and you'll get a lot out of it. And this, lastly, I mean, working in the communities, it seems like you're the butt of every joke, and maybe that's my role as a federal public servant, spending time in the communities. I remember going to a comedy night with Don Burnstick one night, and I think he made us the butt of every joke, and maybe it's good that we're there just so that they can laugh at us. Thank you.
Miigwech, thank you very much, Gary. Colleagues and I do have a saying that if Indigenous peoples are poking fun at you, they're probably like you. So it sounds like you're doing a really good job. Like, I've always been super impressed by your work, and thank you for sharing that with us today. We did hear a lot of kind of theoretical considerations from Steve. I think, you know, some things to highlight at this point before we go to the next speaker is it really is a principles-based approach that we need to take under co-development. We can't really prescribe where we're headed, but we can agree on the way that we're going to work together to get there. And that's what's been discussed a lot today, is that, you know, you really need to build that trust and those relationships first, so that you can have those very honest conversations about where you want to go and how you want to get there. Sorry, I know I just said we don't know where we're going, but at least, you know, how we're going to get there. Without that trust, you can't have those open conversations. So miigwech again to our presenters for highlighting that. I do want to introduce our next presenter now, hoping Amy Cardinal Christensen will be put up on the screen in a minute, if she's successfully logged in, hopefully. So Amy Cardinal Christensen is a Métis scholar. She's from Treaty 8 territory, but currently living in Treaty 6. She is a research scientist with Parks Canada Agency and has been with the federal government for a number of years. As an Indigenous scholar and federal research scientist, she brings her unique experience in community-based fire research in Canada and the value of Indigenous knowledge and respectful practices surrounding good fire practices. She also hosts the Good Fire podcast, which looks at Indigenous fire use around the world. Additionally, her work highlights the alternative approaches and perspectives to support, including funding options, Indigenous research priorities within the federal research ecosystem. She's going to present 4 issues as an Indigenous scholar and public servant working with Indigenous peoples. And so I'll turn it right over to Amy. Miigwech for being with us today.
We have 8 seats. We have at least 8 seats up front for anyone who's in the back who wants to come up front and sit down.
I do know some of you, so don't make me start calling you by name.
All right, go for it, Amy.
Okay, good. Can you just let me know if you can see my screen?
I can see you and we can hear you great.
Can you see the screen though, the share screen?
We can see, yep, it's the 4 issues and the picture has a lot of orange shirts. Yep.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, thanks. Sorry, I'm a bit, because we thought Kyle was going next, but anyways, we'll work it out. So I'm Amy. I'm a Métis woman, as Emily said, from Treaty 6. So I'm in Rocky Mountain House. That's where I live today. And so thanks for the opportunity to present virtually. I'm a mom of 2 young kids, so it's hard to travel all the time. And thanks to my other co-presenters for going. Your presentations were great. So yeah, I guess I'm here to present about what Stephen called the bumps in the road. So it's things that I've encountered as a federal public servant and an Indigenous person. Trying to, do my work, basically, I guess is how to put it. And I think, I want to make sure too, this isn't a criticism of individuals or anything. but rather of the system that we're all operating in. So most of the folks that I work with, are also very frustrated at some of these processes that we constantly encounter. And I know in the audience too, it's not just all federal public servants, but I think there's very similar issues encountered in academia and funding and other things. So another thing I just want to say is that many of the things that I'm going to present are barriers and then workarounds that I found, but I really want to emphasize that we shouldn't always have to be working around barriers. And I find like with my colleagues and stuff, there's a barrier here and we're always trying to, okay, how do we go around it? When really the simplest thing is actually just to remove that barrier that's in place in the first place. So this is a picture of a camp that we recently hosted at Rocky Mountain House Historic Site, a Métis cultural fire camp. And it was a really big effort. There was Rocky Mountain House Historic Site staff there. Myself, we had Métis elders, Métis artists, the BAMP fire crew. We had 89 Métis participants there as well. So yeah, some of these are related to just trying to get events like that off the ground. So issue one, as I'm sure that you're all familiar with, is paying honorariums to people that want to work with us. And this is one of my hugest frustrations that I encounter. So these are all pictures of different elders and Indigenous knowledge holders just in the last, actually, few weeks that I've worked with and been at events at. And honestly, even as a research scientist, almost all of my time is devoted to setting up agreements and then trying to pay people. And it's super frustrating, like just all the financial things that go on and that I have to deal with, and that the elders as well and knowledge holders that we work with have to deal with. Because most of them want to work with us, especially in fire management, which I'm part of. They want to be involved, but it's the process is just so frustrating. So generally what happens, so I want to say too that I'm with Parks Canada now, but this isn't just a criticism of parks. I've worked in multiple departments and it's the same all over, that we really have these barriers around paying honoraria. And my frustration with it is that for me, I spend so much time building relationships with people and communities. And then, one bad experience with our financial system, and that relationship will be severed for me. Like, I can't have those people back. They won't want to come to events. And we've had at times where it takes up to, 2 to 3 months to pay people. With parks now, they have a better system that's more streamlined, but it still will take up to a month after an event to pay an elder. And so if an elder is out, airfare, hotel, other costs, many elders don't even have credit cards. So it's really difficult to try and pay them. And I'm always interested too, because in the federal government, I've found since I started here that we don't bulk when we're signing agreements with consultants for hundreds of thousands or $1 million. But we seem to really bulk at paying elders and knowledge holders for their knowledge at similar rates. And I know that there's limits lots of times with federal government on, okay, it's $250 for a meeting. It's, $500 for a day event, or whatever the standard rates are. And really, when we look at that and compare that to what we're paying consultants, it's much lower. So some tips that I found for working is that my number one is that I'm often now partnering with organizations that can pay cash. So what I'll do is I'll sign some sort of contribution agreement with a different group, an outside group, that then they can deal with me. They have the admin, they have the knowledge to kind of sign these agreements. But then they can just hand the elder a cash envelope. And I found it, like one of the elders that was in the last slide, I handed him a cash envelope after he spoke at one of our events. And he was just thrilled, like that, he got cash and that he didn't have to go through the whole rigmarole with us of trying to actually get paid for the work that he did. So that's one thing that I'd highly recommend. It takes a lot of work up front before the event to get that agreement in place, send money, all those things, but it's really worth it in the end. I also find that after events, it's really important, like everyone gets burned out after an event, but the day after or even that evening, you should be working on the elders' paperwork to try and get their claim into the system as soon as possible. And I do all of the elder paperwork for them. So I just ask them to submit me receipts. I've seen before where other people will just send them an invoice and say, okay, fill this out and get it back to us. But it's really not fair to the elders. Many don't even have printers or anything that they can sign things with. And so it's one thing that I take on. And again, it's just for me that one bad payment experience can really sever a relationship. And I mean, I'm hoping with the federal government that we'll come up with even better payment systems so that we can really keep good relations with our Indigenous partners to make it easier that when, we want to work with them, that we're able to compensate them in a reasonable manner and amount of time. So issue number 2 that I found is that there's an over-reliance on a few Indigenous staff and subsequent burnout. And so this is me at that Métis camp that we organized, pretty much having a mental breakdown on the first day. By the time, we had done all the work, got all the people there, a lot of it was relying on my personal relationships with people, all the agreements in place and other things. Yeah, it was just overwhelming to finally, start and kind of get through it. And that's one of the little Métis boys that was there who ran up and gave me a hug because he obviously could tell that I was just having a day. But I think that's one thing that I found is that I'm, right now, since our new government and the focus on reconciliation is that everyone wants to focus on in working with Indigenous nations, but we have so few Indigenous staff. And so we're often the ones who get, I guess, burdened almost with having to do all of these things by ourselves. And, there is always allied support or, support from our colleagues, but it's really not the same as, being an Indigenous person trying to work with your nation and uphold good relations. So, I mean, one of the things here is like for tips is, having true allyship from people. So, having someone that helps you with those agreements and other things. I want to say too, there's a really good article or a series of articles called Accomplices, Not Allies. There's a lot of like swear words in it. So a note to anyone if you read that article, but it really talks about how to be a true ally to Indigenous people in this space. Another thing that's really works is cohort hiring, where you hire a group of Indigenous people that then have that support and can work together for one another. And the third one is like, I'm often thinking like, does that person actually need to be a GOC employee? Do they need to work for the government of Canada? Do they need to submit to our hiring process and, fingerprints and all those different things? Or can we just sign a contribution agreement with their nation and they can do the same work for us, but being with their nation in a much better support system? So issue number 3 that I'm really running into lately as I'm starting to work in more of the higher level policy things is the reliance or the over reliance on these 5 years limited funding that's limited on our government budgetary cycle. So this was one of the lines here is one of the things that we were part of for wildfires and getting money and with Natural Resources Canada that was announced in the last budget. And it's really exciting because we did get money to work with Indigenous people. But you'll see here that it's like everything's over 5 years. So 30, like the bottom point, 37.9 million over 5 years, starting in 2023. And then we did manage to get a little bit ongoing to train 1,000 firefighters and incorporate Indigenous traditional knowledge in fire management. But the concern is always like, well, what happens when that money runs out? So we're going to spend it on building all these relationships. And then in 5 years, are we just going to have nothing? And I find it interesting that as federal public servants, like we're all paid to be there full time. And we seem to have no issue with making long-term commitments to ourselves. But, we do in working with Indigenous nations and spending the money there. And like for many people, we're always relying on with parks, like B-based funding or, not the A-base that's more the long term, but always project funding to work with Indigenous nations. And it's really limiting on trying to build those great relationships that the last 2 presenters were speaking about. And so here, tip is, I don't really have a tip for this because I'm still struggling. I always hear, oh, we can't do it. We can't commit to more than the 5 years. But I noticed reading through the budget, there's tons of commitments there that are way more than 5 years. And so we need policymakers here to help us push for longer term commitments for Indigenous communities. So like if you're working on, budget proposals and other things, just start to think like, okay, maybe 5 years isn't enough for developing these relationships with Indigenous communities. And can we push here for more money for a longer period of time? So issue number 4 is one that, I've ran into the whole time, and I've actually been a little bit shocked with it with the federal government, is non-Indigenous public servants either evaluating or approving Indigenous programs or funding. And I think that it really comes from that paternalistic attitude. So lots of times as public servants, we'll decide what Indigenous people need, what we should be funding, and other things. And I think many times we totally miss the mark on what communities actually need. And it comes, like I said, it comes across as so paternalistic. And then communities are constantly coming to us for program funding based on what we've determined are important for them. And I have this one thing up for the Indigenous Guardian. So at Parks, we have an Indigenous Guardian program that's great. But one issue there is that I know they're developing this, but right now there's no kind of Indigenous oversight of what programs get funded. So it's basically, non-Indigenous public servants that are saying like, yes, this program qualifies, this program doesn't. So it's like us or like public servants setting the agenda and the values for Indigenous nations. So the main tip that I found around this is, to have Indigenous advisory committees for these type of things. But again, you need money to compensate people adequately for their time, which we talked about before. And also these must be formed before the project. So sometimes even before you're putting in that budget ask to get the money. It's frustrating, I think, for Indigenous people when there's already like a pot of money assigned and then they're asked to come in and evaluate projects for it when, part of them, I think, thinks, well, this money should have gone elsewhere, or, there's a different need in our community that would have been better. So again, it's about forming those long-term relationships. And for me, like my relationships with communities are long-term. So when I commit to working with the community, like I'm still working with communities that I worked with 20 years ago. And I think that's one thing with the federal government, because we're looking at such project-based funding, but really we need to be looking at, these long-term Indigenous advisory committees and, keeping people on advising our departments for a longer amount of time. And right now, too, a real danger is that we have everyone jumping in on through reconciliation, which is great. But now with the federal government, many of the requirements now are that funded projects require an Indigenous component, which again is great. And I'm glad that we're doing this. But many of us and outside research, Indigenous researchers will suddenly get cold called. We want you to be involved on this project. Like I, as a non-Indigenous person, I'm going to be the PI. And it's going to give me $4 million or whatever, but you can be on it as a project advisor. And it's like these cold calls without any relationship building that can be very insulting. So I think that that's another thing, just to bring up is that it's really important to develop those relationships before just, cold calling people, because as you can imagine, it comes like if someone just contacted you and suddenly said, I want you to be part of this huge grant, that they're going to get all the credit for, and you're going to be hired as a community researcher making $15 an hour. Like it's pretty insulting. So yeah, there we go. I think I'm done my rant about issues that I've encountered, and happy to talk about questions after the final presenter.
Bruce, Amy, I think there were a lot of hard truths. We were, I think, provoked maybe to just to talk about those hard truths today. And I think you did a fabulous job. So Kyle gets the last 10 minutes of speaking, and then we're going to open the floor up for questions. Kyle Bobby Wash is an Indigenous scholar and assistant professor, and Kyle, can I say a friend, in the Department of Entomology and the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences at the University of Manitoba. His research really focuses on understanding the ecology of beneficial insects in, ecosystems and the greater landscape. and he agreed to be on the pesticide advisory committee for Health Canada. So thank you very much, Kyle. And I think I'm just going to turn the floor over to you. You've been a member of the Aboriginal Reconciliation Council at developing Simon Fraser's University Indigenous Reconciliation Strategy. So tell us a little bit about your views about building an equitable Canada science system. Thanks, Kyle.
Yeah, and thanks, Kara. It's kind of nice being at the end because all these fantastic presenters before me basically kind of highlighted all the messages that I wanted to share. But I kind of just wanted to highlight a few things that I think we tend to neglect a little bit. And I have to start a little bit with my own journey and how I became a researcher. And a lot of that happens when you are just so entranced and so enthused about nature or particular systems when you're young. And for me, it was the honey ant, right? And I read so much about this honey ant, and I was just so fascinated by it. And a lot of this interest was driven through documentaries that you might see on the Discovery Channel or something like that, right? And anytime and I just wanted to highlight David Attenborough. Every time you'd see these presenters talk about these resources or these species that are particularly important for Indigenous communities or Indigenous territories, it would always be an old white guy of some sort, right? Somebody who can talk about science in a British accent, so it makes it sound, a lot more impactful. So, you already start to create this conception of that's what science is, or that's who science serves. And it wasn't until later into my life when my father got me a piece of Indigenous art from Australia that I actually started to better understand not only the relationships between Indigenous people internationally and the land, but also about something as simple as ants and how that plays a big role. And I don't know if people are aware of this, but there's this concept of this honey ant dreaming in the Northern Territories in Australia. And, looking at kind of the honey ants, you can already see that there's these, these compartments, these caverns, these networks, these tunnels. And for Indigenous people, not only are honey ants a really important resource, but they're also a way to think about the organization of your physical, your social, your spiritual connections to the world. And in one of these communities where the Indigenous art movement in the 1970s started, due to some of these really cool paintings inspired by ant colonies, even their communities themselves are organized along very similar principles that ants might organize their colonies along. And, if we take a look at how, they might think about the representation of all of these nodes and the interconnecting sections of these nodes. Not only are they there to, just facilitate movement in a community, but it actually drives, the tone, the texture of those intellectual, social, spiritual relationships that you're going to have with other people, abiotic or biotic resources or spiritual resources. And, thinking about these things also tended to actually motivate and enhance the effectiveness of developing economic opportunities and a lot of that mentorship that was happening in this particular community. And why I wanted to highlight that story a little bit is because, these images, these ways of how we think about the world still matter. This is an old map from Samuel de Champlain. And I would, posit that, we still think of Canada as this great place of natural resources. And it's the fact that these natural resources are here has resulted in Canada being such, a leader in so many fields, in education, in public service, in research. But we forget that, yeah, that's one component, but, the other component is this idea, and I think one of the people in the room mentioned, right, there's a lot of other ways to look at this, right? Canada succeeded because it stole all those resources, right? And we see these marks and we see these different ways of representing our relationships on the land. These are some petroglyphs in Ontario near where I grew up. And even here, this tells us, it's relatively simplistic, very different than Samuel de Champlain's, humans here, brute here, insects or birds, animals here. These are canoes associated with animals, but these animals also represent groups and distinct groups of people, right? So this is, just the simple pictograph or a petroglyph right here is really describing the relationships, the roles, and the responsibilities that particular people had to particular aquatic, terrestrial, or spiritual systems. And even if we look at some of the other petroglyphs, not only do we have, kind of the structure, the instructions of the frameworks of how people are interrelating and how they're, or what they're responsible for, but we also might see something like this, which is, kind of describing the curriculum pathway that a Medewin or a medicine person might take with these 4 spheres of education or attainment required to become, this really valuable and a very valuable teacher in some of these traditional methods. And we know kind of there's all sorts of imagery of humans or indigenous people, that sometimes they're, this sacred Indian, that all exists as well. But I think even contemporarily these days, we still talk about, or we still view these things in an interesting way, right? We often talk about stewards, right? We use these big grandiose words. We still think about some of this knowledge, having to uncover knowledge. But when I think about Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous methodologies, right, I am much more happy thinking about Molly of Denali, right? This, to me, is better representations of Indigenous methodologies and ways of knowing. Molly, right here we see Molly learning dancing and drumming from one of her friends. She's learning about mactac, whale blubber, and begging her family to go harvest herring eggs, and understanding, developing those processes, and having children being able to see not only kind of the output or the result of having Indigenous collaboration in science, but what does that process actually look like on the ground? And I think Molly of Denali is doing a really fantastic job, so I highly recommend this. I'll skip over a few slides. Just again, talk about what's out there and how we have got here, right? Vic Burks, again, fantastic researcher, but even the terminology, right? This rediscovery of traditional ecological knowledge as adaptive management. Already that is providing a particular lens or perspective of, where was Indigenous knowledge? Was it lost? Did it have to be discovered? Or have we just ignored it? And I think it's really important to think about these ways we contextualize things, because we have all sorts of issues associated with data or intellectual property, right? We're always looking for better ways to improve science, to improve conservation, to improve, health systems, economic systems. And we're going to communities, we're partnering with communities to actually kind of uncover and utilize a lot of these ways of knowing to potentially, diversify how we know things. But one thing that we don't necessarily consider is that, have we created that system that can actually accept that and actually utilize these things in a proper way? Sure, we're very grateful for the diversity of traits that might make a bean variety resistant to pathogens, but are we able to actually incorporate bean ceremonies into the economy of of the market economy of selling and exporting beans? If we're not ready for that, should we actually even be looking for this Indigenous knowledge or this Indigenous collaboration around something like beans? And when we look at every system, again, this is another example of food systems with corn, but again, there's so much more there than just those simple kind of, typical Western or conventional scientific approaches to data. It is very much about the relationship and how you're going to utilize or what you are going to do with this particular piece of data. So I like people, I ask people to think about your knowledge systems and think about what are those major drivers, right? We know it has Western science. We want transparency, repeatability, hypothesis-based. But Indigenous knowledges, and not only in Canada, but globally, they're going to be, formed and developed upon a very different framework and foundation. And something that I kind of wanted to highlight with my last minute was that there's all sorts of considerations to take. So this is some work from Isaac Murdoch and Christy Belcourt. And this is kind of highlighting that work that's being done right now on water protection. And we know water knowledge is particularly important in almost all communities, and is centered in women's societies and women themselves. But we don't actually have a lot of women, in academia, being able to, or just saying in general, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, we still know that there's not parity when it comes to women in academia. So I think something that we really need to focus on as we're developing ways to, make science better and actually support Indigenous self-determination and research is to start identifying those resources and those means to actually be able to create those actual experts, the people that we need in academia, in the public service, in community. We have to support this at that level. Whether it's Greta, Leah, or Autumn, right? These are our leaders that are changing a lot of the ways that we talk about, or we view, or we think about science, and making sure that any research and any work that we're doing, or any policy that we develop, actually is addressing those knowledge systems and supporting the development, the creation, and the maintenance of those knowledge systems is really important. This is just as important as any, types of big, fancy $1 million research that we'll do. It's making sure that we have those intergenerational links that really bond and create those resilient knowledge systems in communities. That's what's really important. And we have all sorts of fantastic examples where that's happening right now with Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Amy talked about the Guardians program. It's relatively simple systems that bring communities together and create that capacity, or create that space where we can start having these interactions and actually allow Indigenous knowledge systems to become rebuilt and start to evolve to be able to address a lot of those complex challenges. So, see science through the eyes of Indigenous people, right? If you wanted to dress up like Molly from Denali, she would want you to dress like this, right? She wouldn't want you to wear all sorts of traditional regalia. These are Molly's favorite clothes, her favorite clothes. So when we think about creating these frameworks, we have to create frameworks. We have to create policy systems. We have to create science systems that actually incorporate those values that are held up high by particular Indigenous groups. And again, something I kind of just wanted to highlight, thinking about even just the basis of which science is, founded on, right? We have to think about how can we actually change it to allow more diversity to actually flourish, right? That publish or perish model that we've all been living in, that's probably antiquated and not going to do the job. But this publish and flourish, where we're promoting collaboration and making sure that marginalized and non-represented people are involved. This is the elements that are going to drive that true change and potentially that reconciliation that we want. Thank you.
Well, Kachina Gwech, Kyle, it's always great to hear you speak, and we're very happy to have you as our wrap-up speaker, because you're always great at sort of carrying, putting together all the words that everyone else has spoken about. So I know that we've gone a bit over time. Our apologies for that. So I think we'd like to go directly to questions and take a few questions from the floor. So there is a microphone here, but I think we can also just repeat the question back so that our speakers can hear it. So please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Oksana. I'm PhD candidate with the University of Saskatchewan, and my research focuses on Indigenous consultations. And what I'm doing is exactly what today's panel discusses: interpretive approach to co-creation, knowledge, and practice-based approach. So it is, I actually appreciate for all panelists what they told about the necessity of the co-creation knowledge based on practice. And my first question will be directed to Stephen. You talked about power. How can we manage power asymmetries in the ethical space because I see this as the hardest issue to manage power asymmetries. And jumping to speech, Dr. Ami, I appreciate your research, and I just wish to bring to your attention the different case, which was very much successful in terms of co-creation knowledge between indigenous rangers and government officials. This is Australian case from Australia. Knowledge co-creation was leading not by government, but on a forest swamp indigenous community. So indigenous community lead this practice, this workshop, and officials participated in this in knowledge co-production, and we can see that this practice was actually very much successful because initiative was from indigenous communities. So returning to Steve, how do we see which ways can we apply to manage power differentials in the creating common space for co-production of knowledge? Thanks. I'm sorry for being a little bit long.
Thanks so much for that really important question. And there's I think of it in two different ways. In some regards, we were talking about kind of one aspect is thinking more specifically about ensuring there is greater authority in decision making, and so really identifying opportunities for that and making space for that. And then the second, when it comes to these power asymmetries, these can manifest or be perpetuated in many different ways. And I think some of the other kind of barriers that Amy was highlighting, something as simple as thinking about who has the funds and how are funds distributed, right? If as a collaborator, if you're the one who's still paying, then that's not really, there is this power differential that happens. It's not, fully supporting self-determination and research or self-determination and collaboration, right? So that communities can collaborate when, where, and how they want to. So it's about trying to identify some of those different leverage points or barriers. So I think those are the key. We haven't identified them all, but we haven't, kind of dug into that. But there are some great examples out there, and I think there's more that can be done. But it's really getting into the nuances of some of the different policies and practices that are in place, like honorariums. How are those distributed? How do we change that to really change those power asymmetries that can manifest or be perpetuated? I saw Kyle's hand up, so I'll pause there. But
maybe I'll just highlight it. Stephen's exactly right. Remove those power asymmetries, right? Why do Indigenous people need to report to NSERC? NSERC, DFO, parks, we should be reporting to Indigenous people, right? We're on those lands. We have to figure out a mechanism to be able to break those things down. And funding, again, is one of the big ones.
Yep. Oh, thank you. We have time for one more question. And yeah, here she comes.
A pretty fast question. Talking with colleagues here, I've seen a big push towards northern funds, towards research in the north. And unfortunately, something I've heard, not here, but is the idea that, oh, well, no, this is a northern fund. It's not an Indigenous fund, which to me is like, of course, you cannot say that. So could you perhaps provide commentary or insight on ways to emphasize the importance of the Indigenous people when looking at creating northern funds?
I wonder, it's a great question. I wonder if there's anyone on the panel that wants to take that first.
I'll chime in. Instead of just having northern funds, why don't we just have an Indigenous fund, right? I think even the Northern Research Supplements through something like NSERC, right, that allows you to, it thinks about covering those costs and that extra work associated with working in the north, but it actually doesn't actually incorporate that extra work that's needed to work with Indigenous peoples, right? There's a lot of work that's not research focused, that's about relationship. You have to have parties, you have to have dinners, right? You have to really go out there and hang out with Indigenous people to create that relationship, to actually make that research relevant and make sure that you're doing that research in a way that's prioritized by those communities. So yes, these northern supplements are fantastic, but we also have to have ways to build relationships. That's as important a part of research as everything else. And increasingly we're trying to get better at that. So it's just kind of encouraging everybody to continue funding those types of activities as well as part of those research pools.
Can I just add very quickly to that? I would say too that do we need to do that, or can we just send the money to communities to do their own research? I don't know why we're always thinking we need to parachute in or be involved. Can we just set up a contribution agreement where the money just goes to those nations in the north that can then do research that they feel is important? So we never kind of go back to that initial step. Why are we even funding these things?
I just wanted to clarify. I totally agree with that. But I was asking because we're already in the process of creating the fund, and I just want to be able to have things to emphasize the importance of including the Indigenous people and getting, they should be one of the key factors.
Well, I think a topic that's come up numerous times today is the strength-based approach, and I don't think we've talked about that a lot. And so in the past, and actually in an ongoing basis, what we see is a lot of research proposals that propose to solve problems for First Nations. There's high diabetes rates, there's high rates of food insecurity. And, Indigenous peoples are already experts in their own home territories, their own sciences, their own food systems. And so it's enabling that Indigenous knowledge that's been curated here since time immemorial, that has co-evolved with the ecosystems here in Canada, that is most suitable to the ecosystems here in Canada, enabling that strength-based approach of those Indigenous sciences to be practiced by their own practitioners. That's if people are not understanding that when they're developing policies and programs, they shouldn't be working on them. Does the panel have anything else to add? Steve, and then Kyle, please.
I think we have one final question.
And then one final question.
Yeah, I think we're just cheering you on, Emily.
Okay, Miigwech. Kyle, did you want to go ahead though? I see you poised. No? Okay. Question from the audience then.
I don't have a question so much as I have a bit of an example or a few examples to share. So I'm sorry if it'll take a little too much time. So my name is Nicole Olivier. I'm programs manager for the Canadian Mountain Network. A few people from Health Canada have stopped by my booth today. So Gary, thanks for stopping by, as he heard me on my soapbox for quite a while. But we've worked exhaustively to solve some of these challenges, and it takes a lot of work and people power to do it. So when you're making contribution agreements and you're funding a call for proposals, you have to think about it from creatively, and you have to work with your institution in terms of breaking down those barriers and getting those agreements out there. So we ran a call for proposals, and the requirements were that scientists and Indigenous needed to be, if scientists wanted to lead something, they had to lead it. They had to design and propose a co-lead structure for that work. And the contribution agreements, the money had to not flow through X university, who was then going to dole out the money, and the First Nation wasn't going to then submit their invoices and so on. We wrote, I don't even know how many contribution agreements, and our agreements went to this university and that industry, and then that First Nation, and the First Nations who partnered in those programs got the funds directly. So they had to do it. Now, the flip side of that is then they have to report back, and they have to fill out those reporting, and we all have to report back up. Then we're in NCE, and so that happens. But you have to think about it, and you have to push those boundaries. And so when we pay honoraria, we did it again through that way. When we pay honoraria, we have a separate account that the money is sitting in, and we can write that check directly. And you write that check, and when you work with those elders and communities, it's exactly what you said. They tell you what their value, they tell you what the value and the cost is, because again, their cost of living and their circumstances and their time is different. And you don't argue with a consultant when they say it's $200 an hour or $300 an hour. You just pay it. It's the same, and we need to take a look at it from that perspective. And you know that up front, and you cut that check. So that's the same, and we just have to approach it differently. And when we do that, you need to have the time up front. And so that's the other part of the project puzzle: time, scope, and cost, right? And we don't plan for time. And an example of that is where the government has really succeeded in some ways is this SPORE program. And I used to work in that area as well. And so you look at the strategy for patient-oriented research and the IAP to scale the spectrum of engagement. And you go back and look at that, and you plan for the time up front, and you look for funding calls where they pre-allocate the funding to do the engagement up front so that you can bring them together at the beginning of the puzzle. So just wanted to share that.
Yeah, thank you. And I wish everyone could share. We had, obviously this needs to be 3 hours. And I think what we're hearing is time, and maybe scheduling this session in the regular time slot that, you know, with which we organize our meetings probably wasn't maybe the best thing to do. So Emily, can I let you say the last words, please? And do I say with gratitude?
Well, Kishimigwech, what I want to say to the folks here in this room, especially because we did see a lot of federal hands go up, we're all very, very excited to work on truth and reconciliation with external Indigenous partners. Please don't forget your Indigenous public servant colleagues who deserve just as much respect and truth-telling, relationship building, and trust building. And we're all very, very happy to work together on this, but that trust and that truth-telling needs to happen. So Kichimigwech, I'll be here for a few more minutes to, if people want to continue having conversation. And thank you so much to all of our panelists. Really great to always see you. Yeah, Miigwech.